Welcome to the Office of the State Auditor Spring 2022 State Compliance Audit Guide training. My name is Seth Oveson, and my goal is to bring you up to speed on the State Compliance Guide in the next 15 minutes. In the past, we've provided an update for CPA firms in a separate training for local governments. Today, we'll walk through the guide and we'll provide insights for both the CPA community and local entities. Hopefully, this format will help local governments know what their external auditors are looking for so they can be better prepared. I'm going to start out here with the state website that is found at auditor.utah.gov. You can click on About Us here in the top right corner and Directory to be able to see the contact information for the different people in our office. This is our local government team. If you call the main line, there's a good chance you'll talk to Brooke. She's great and she takes care of all kinds of issues like password resets, compliance questions, finding resources, and she does a great job. If you have transparency questions, you'll want to reach out to Alex and Kramer. If you have any other questions, they can be directed to myself, Calvin Bergman, or Rob. So from anywhere on the State Auditor's website, in the top of the page, you can click on this button. It says For Local Governments, and that will bring you over to the Local Government Resource Center. It doesn't matter if you're a CPA firm or work for a governmental entity. I would encourage you to bookmark this page. There's a couple things on this page that I want to show you. There's the forms, manuals, and guides. There's explanations and templates. If you're looking for a template policy, it's here. If you want to check the compliance, so you've got a notice or somebody has a question, if you're on hold or if you're current, you can check that right here with the compliance dashboard. That works for any entity in the state. So if you're a CPA firm and you have a client that called and asked, why are we on hold? You could come here or direct them here, and they can check and see what it is that they're missing. To enter the state reporting system, you can do that right here through this button, and you can check your data quality here. Now, for our purposes, we're going to Forms, Manuals, and Guides, and then we'll scroll down to the section for the State Compliance Audit Guide, which is right here. You'll see that there are two versions. There's a version for 2021 and a version for 2022. If you only care about what's changed, click right here on the Changes to the State Compliance Audit Guide, and see what's happened in the last year as those things have changed. And we are conscious of the time that it takes auditors to complete the procedures that are lined out in the guide, and we try to rotate them in and out on a rotating basis. I'm going to click right here on the guide itself and pull this up. There are 4 chapters. Chapter 1, procedures that are performed every year. Chapter 2 are the procedures that are performed once in 3 years. Chapter 3 is only for local education agencies, and Chapter 4 is the reporting section. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you're pulling this up for an audit, make sure that you're checking the revision history and you make sure that you're using the most recent revision. If we find errors in the guide, or if something's brought to our attention, or if statute changes, we will make a revision and state what we've changed. I'm going to jump right down here to Chapter 1A. This is the planning section, where the auditor should review the design of internal controls for compliance. For instance, what controls does the entity have to ensure budgetary compliance? Is there a finance officer? Is there a standardized budget process, managerial review to make sure that the required public hearings happen when they're adopting their budget? Are there procedures to review expenditures to ensure that they are within the budgetary parameters set by the governing body? These controls should be documented, and it will expedite the audit process if the local government already has the process mapped out and can give copies of that to their external auditors before they arrive. The next section is for budgetary compliance. There are tests to determine if the entity properly approved and abided by their budget. Now, one thing to point out is this legal reference column right here. There are hyperlinks to the Utah Code for each of these requirements. It can be used as a quick reference if you are either the entity or the auditor and you want to go back to the statute and read through the statute and make sure you're on the right path. You can just click on this link and follow it over to the legislature's website. The next section that we have is for fund balance. There are no new changes here. An entity shouldn't have a deficit fund balance, and there are different budgetary limitations depending on the type of entity that you are. Next section is for justice courts. So if you don't have a justice court in your city, or if you are a special service district, this one won't apply to you. Just be marked NA. You won't have to continue with that. The procedures here center around internal controls and how an entity records revenues into Chorus for court cost transactions. So you can see it's looking at how those are entered in and some exceptions on what they shouldn't see. This was an area that was identified by the Administrative Office of the Courts as a problem. And to aid with this section, there's an appendix that's the testing that's used by the Administrative Office of the Courts when they're performing an audit. We've included that so that the external auditors can see the way that the courts would look at that, and they can approach it in the same way. The next section is on restricted taxes and other restricted revenue. Like the section for justice courts, this section has an appendix that can be useful to tell the difference between different revenue streams, particularly the different optional sales taxes. Both the auditor and the entity staff should be familiar with the restrictions and differences between the different taxes that the entity levies. The next section here is for the fraud risk assessment. This is very short, but this is one area that's had several questions in the last year. The fraud risk assessment is an annual requirement. The entity should fill out the assessment and discuss it in a meeting during the year, and the entity has 180 days to submit the form, the same as any of their other reports that they submit to our office. When the form is submitted, we are only requesting the one-page summary with the signatures and not all of the supporting documentation. The auditors are required to verify that the assessment was discussed in a meeting. The intention is to encourage entities to perform their own risk assessment and develop courses of action to mitigate or eliminate any risks that they identify. And we'd like to encourage conversations regarding entity risk to go beyond the items listed in the form. So as board members discuss things, they should bring up any items that they are worried about. It's a good, convenient time to have that conversation since you're taking care of the fraud risk assessment questions anyway, and create a plan of action for how the entity can improve over the next year. Government fees. This section of the guide was added to in 2022. In March of 2022, we issued a draft auditor alert. It's Auditor Alert 2022-1, and it's on development fees, following a review of several cities and counties' fees and expenses for building permits and plan reviews. For anyone, CPA or local entity staff, to understand the purpose of this compliance section, they really need to read Auditor Alert 2018-3 on government fees and the V1 Oil versus the Utah State Tax Commission. And I'm going to just jump out here really fast. I'm going to go back to this. Scroll down to our Auditor Alerts. This is the Auditor Alert on fees. And there are some excerpts here to the GFOA's materials on how to charge a fee. Also, here's the reference for that court case and some information from that court case that talks about fees and what it takes to have a legitimate fee for service and what's expected of a regulatory fee, that it must bear a reasonable relationship to the cost of the thing it is regulating. Very important. If you're auditing or you're preparing for an audit and you're worried about government fees, I would start there so you understand the point of view that the state is coming from of what needs to go into a government fee. Also in this list, we can come up to this Auditor Alert on development fees. Pull it up right here, and you can read the Auditor Alert. At the time of recording this video, it's still in draft form. We hope to finalize that here in the next couple of weeks. So back to the State Compliance Audit Guide. The external auditor will obtain a schedule of fees. They'll make inquiries if there are any other fees that are not included, and make sure that all of the entity's fees are approved by the governing body. That's that first section of fees. Additionally, the auditor will sample some fees an entity collects, including, for municipalities and counties, the development fees, and that goes back to that Auditor Alert I just showed you. The auditor will test that fee revenue is being used for the purposes it was charged, and that the accounting system tracks those fees adequately. For development fees, the auditor will check compliance with applicable code. So that's our section on government fees. Here's the appendix. This is the Chapter 1 appendix. It's to help the CPA firm organize which sections are applicable to any given client. If they don't have a justice court, not include that. If they don't charge impact fees, you wouldn't consider those ones, and to try to keep track of those. This is that second appendix, the one on restricted types of taxes. So these are principally sales taxes on this page, different types of sales taxes, the applicable Utah code, and if there are use restrictions for those types of taxes. Also, these are property taxes and the different types of restrictions that exist for those property taxes. This is the section for justice courts and some things that should be considered: custody of the assets, authorized use, keeping the records, accounting for those. These are the forms that are used by the Administrative Office of the courts. So if the CPA firm wants to use these as well to be on the same page as what the courts does, and or if a local entity wants to use the same type of forms as they're performing their own internal audits, they're welcome to use those forms. So now we are here in Chapter 2. Again, Chapter 2 are the procedures that are required to be performed at least once in every 3 years. If there's a problem area or something's come up, last year there was a problem there, you're going to have to follow up on those repeat findings. Part A is cash management. This test does two things. The first is a quality control mechanism for the deposit investment report, which is collected by the State Treasurer's Office. And the second tests compliance with the 3-day rule for governmental funds. So that Money Management Act test to make sure that any revenue you've received, you've got it deposited in an approved bank within those 3 days. Let's run to Part B. This deals with transfers of funds and loans between enterprise funds and the government's general fund. This type of transfer has specific rules that you have to follow if you're a local government. So if you're a local government and you are contemplating transferring funds from an enterprise fund, you'll want to familiarize yourself with these testing procedures, as well as Auditor Alert 2014-1A. Let's run to Part C. Part C covers tax levy revenue recognition. If you're not sure how this should be handled, you should read GASB 77 and our Auditor Alert 2020-4. To make it a little bit simple, an entity that enacted a tax levy must recognize the revenue and then a contribution to the other governments if they're passing funds to another entity, like a redevelopment area. This can be tricky because sometimes the county treasurer will send those funds directly to that other entity, that redevelopment area. If that's the case, then there is no transfer. You won't receive the funds and then transfer them over. They just go straight to the other entity. And when that happens, you still have to make the transaction. You still have to recognize it as revenue and then pass those through as a contribution to other governments. The next section we have is for impact fees. Impact fees have specific requirements that you should be aware of. These procedures are designed to ensure that an entity tracks and reports their impact fees correctly, recorded by project, who paid the impact fee, because if those fees are not used in the correct period of time, they're required to be returned to the person that paid them. We're coming down here to Part E. This is for special and local district board members. Contact information is required to be posted on the public notice website. Board members are required to be trained. There are pay restrictions for compensation to board members of special and local districts. That restriction can be found at 17B 1-311. But for those unfamiliar with the cap, it's at $5,000. This is for Utah retirement systems. They tests principally go with how the entity enrolls its employees into the system or if they go on leaves of absences. The next section is for public treasurers. Public treasurers are required to be bonded, or as in the case with many entities, this requirement can be satisfied through a crime policy through the entity's insurance provider. Changes to the Open and Public Meetings Act section of the guide. This is an area that we continue to get findings on each year. So if you are a local entity, you should familiarize yourself with this section to make sure that you don't have an audit finding. They'll test when a notice has to be posted on the public notice website. So familiarize yourself with these code sections and the test. Again, those links to the code sections are over here on the far left to help you know where in the code the tests are coming from as we're looking at those things. I'm going to pause just a second. We're going to jump to Chapter 4 before we get into Chapter 3. I want to talk about Chapter 4 just a little bit. Chapter 4 of the Compliance Audit Guide is the reporting section. If you have an audit, you must also submit a report on state compliance and an opinion on internal controls. In the last year, we've had several entities submit their audit without the compliance audit or the internal control opinion. You may submit these as separate documents in the state reporting system. However, our preference is that you submit one file with the financial audit and the opinion on the financial statements, the opinion on internal control, and the state compliance opinion. If the entity has over $750,000 in federal revenues or expense, then a single audit would also be included with that. If the state doesn't receive all of the required reports, then the reporting requirements are not met, and we will send you a courtesy 60-day warning letter and remind you to submit the required report before your funds go on hold. There are example reports here of what this is going to look like. It will list the different sections that are applicable to your entity. Just look for that in your report. You should see this when you're submitting your file. This opinion needs to be in the file as well. Let's jump back here to Chapter 3. Congratulations if you've made it this far and you are not a local education agency or you are not auditing an LEA. You can now stop the video. This section has been revised from prior years, and I will highlight some of these changes. The first thing you'll notice is that it's much smaller, limited the number of prescribed steps that a CPA must take. The first section is to verify compliance with administrative rule with regard to internal controls. So that would be this section A. Right away, I see I have one item that will need to be clarified, and we may change this in our next revision of this guide. This phrase right here that should be considered material with regard to internal controls will be changed to say any non-compliance should be considered reportable. Meaning that if you find any violation of code, even if it's just $1, it needs to be disclosed in the report as another matter. Now, if the violation meets materiality threshold, then the CPA is required to modify their opinion, in which case that opinion letter, it wouldn't say that they have a clean opinion with respect to these things. It would modify that opinion. But even if it's something inconsequential in size, it needs to be reported as a finding. The other clarification I want to make in here is several times in the guide, it says something to the extent of to achieve a low level of assessed risk. Another way of saying this is that the state wants a high level of assurance that the LEA is compliant with the item being tested. Hopefully, with the emphasis on internal controls, the entity will have a control environment that limits the risk, and the auditor will be able to achieve a high level of assurance because there is a low level of risk. The guide this year leaves the method for obtaining this assurance up to the auditor, so it may be done through analytics, substantive testing, or other procedures, but the CPA should document those procedures well. So if in the future the State Board of Education identifies a problem with the LEA, we can go back to the work papers of the external auditor and determine if the difference is because of how they did their sampling or if the entity really has a problem. This is very important right now because we have several entities that are getting mixed messages from the state and from their external auditor on whether or not they're complying properly with different sections of code, and we're trying to unify us to be all on the same page. That is Chapter 3. There's some stuff on school fees. I want to clarify the section on school fees that talks about textbooks. In that guide, the restriction on textbooks and school fees is effective for the 2022-2023 fiscal year. We're leaving it in the guides, and it's going to be noted that it applies to that year, but we want that conversation to happen. So if you're a CPA firm and you talk to your clients, you see that in the guide, you're going to leave it in the guide, but talk to them, know that it's coming up. They need to make sure that they're following that statute. If you have any questions regarding the State Compliance Audit Guide, please feel free to contact myself or any member of the local government team. Again, we can jump back here. You can hit About Us in the directory, and this is where you'll find all of our contact information for our team. It's been a pleasure talking to you guys today. Look forward to hearing from you in the future.